Welcome to Grown Between Worlds, a podcast for adult children of immigrants and the people who love them. We're here to hold real conversations about identity, belonging, love, and life across cultures.
And we're committed to creating a space that feels grounding, honest, and human. Each conversation here touches on sensitive themes, which may feel deep or tender. We invite you to listen or watch at your own pace and take good care of yourself.
I'm Forouz.
And I'm Miranda. We're so glad you're on this journey with us.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Today's guest is Gio Iacono. He is an assistant professor at the University of Connecticut School of Social Work. He completed his master's and PhD at the University of Toronto. He identifies as a white, queer, cisgender man and is a first-generation university graduate who immigrated to the USA from Canada. He has worked as a psychotherapist, clinical social worker, educator, community organizer, and researcher in a variety of health and community-based settings for over 15 years. And his community organizing and advocacy work have primarily focused on diverse LGBTQIA+ communities. Welcome, Gio. We're so happy to have you here today.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So tell us a bit about your personal connection to immigration.
Okay, so where do I begin? So I am really I'll start with, as an adult, claiming the identity that you described and just like thinking of what it means to be Canadian and having parents who have immigrated to Canada and what that means in terms of my identity. I mean, there's been, I think growing up, it would be, you might have seen Italo-Venezuelan, Canadian, but I think there were just so many different ways of understanding it. But yeah, my dad is of an Italian background. My mom is of an Italian background and grew up in Venezuela, migrated to Toronto in the 60s. And so I was born in the 80s where, it's a different context, and I can get into that a little bit more as we continue. But and now living and working in the U.S. as a social work professor definitely comes with a different perspective around immigration.
Yeah, great. So you're essentially a second-generation immigrant. You were born into an immigrant family. Sounds like relatively well after your parents had settled in Canada.
Yeah. So born in a relatively large immigrant family. So after they settled in Canada, I think really the relationship to immigration being really different from relatives and, who did the actual migrating. So I think what came up for me is like just growing up in this, what I would see is like I guess almost like an afterglow or aftershock of the move. So just hearing stories about sacrifice, anxieties around like surviving and acculturating and just, sort of the separation and dividing and staying within their sort of, comfort and cultural sort of context was really important. Yeah. And then what that meant for us as Canadian born kids, I have 3 siblings, and just what that meant for us in terms of navigating these different kind of cultural contexts within this like dominant Canadian society.
Yeah, sacrifice and survival. Those 2 words, I think a lot of adult children of immigrants could probably relate to hearing a lot from family.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. And I think also just the experience of immigrating later in life to the US, and albeit coming with an opportunity already in place and immigration support, privileged immigrant experience and status as a white identified person, male identified person, many sort of layers there that I'm still kind of navigating and trying to understand in the context of sort of US immigration and anti-immigration sort of context and policy. So a lot of layers there, and that continues to add to the complexity of my own identity as someone who grew up in an immigrant family and still very much connects to the cultural sort of roots of family. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think you've already spoken a bit about your family's immigration experience and how it differs a bit from your own from Canada to the USA. Now, looking at yourself as an adult and the cultural or ethnic or national identities that you might claim now, what influenced or impacted you as you were choosing these identities? And has that influence shifted or changed over time, or has your identity changed over time? Right.
So I think I see my identities as fluid, and that could be said of all the identities that I choose to um, sort of kind of connect to. Obviously, things around race and ethnicity, and like those are to me not in a fluid format or way, but just thinking of the ways that I see myself as, yeah, growing up in Toronto in a mostly sort of, I guess, Italian kind of community. And that's what fit around, the Sunday table in our local community context. The Venezuelan side was there with food and with music and language. But the Italian Catholic piece, the rituals and all that, that was very, very prominent and dominant, actually, and visible. So at the same time, growing up in the mid 90s, realizing I'm queer and in a context that's still saturated with AIDS phobia or homophobia, transphobia. I mean, it's similar to today, of course, but queerness was not something that in our family had a clear kind of affirming place. And so that really shaped how I saw myself just as a human and growing and developing these identities. And so learning to split came up a lot. So like this dutiful, like immigrant child or son, wanting to make your parents proud, while also being this closeted queer kid. And so I'm like, and then I think just kind of looking at like how I went like naming myself in a way that feels like authentic and, seeing myself as, yeah, an immigrant and a child of immigrants. And I think there's just a little bit of feeling like there's a little bit of ambiguity and just uncertainty, and in some level it feels okay. I don't know if I need that concrete, here's my identity, here's how, this is where I'm at. It's less fixed and more kind of, like I'm saying, fluid or sort of almost destabilized, which can be a little, stressful at times. But yeah, so I think I really try to bring in an integrated approach and a political approach to the way I understand my identities or the way I share my identities, recognizing sort of inherent sort of structural components that provide and systemic components that provide opportunities or privileges, and then of course barriers potentially in other ways. So just really trying to kind of hold that all in the balance when I think of my own identities.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think what you're describing, this kind of the ambiguity of it, the uncertainty of it, the confusion, the doubt that comes with kind of trying to figure out what the right labels are to claim, right? And that these labels don't necessarily accurately or effectively reflect all of who we are. And they're impacted and influenced by so many different things, right? So for you, you were born into a family that was primarily Italian, but had like Venezuelan roots as well. And there's a lot of cultural, but also like Catholic religious influences in you growing up. And then starting to realize your own queer identity. And sometimes realizing certain aspects of our identity takes us away from other parts of our identity as we're trying to kind of explore it, as we're trying to bring more meaning to it, especially if, as a closeted queer person, you're recognizing whether it's very directly named or you're just kind of like sensing in your body and the energies of the relationships and that perhaps your queerness might not be allowed to have space or welcomed in the same way as other parts of your identity.
No, no, and that's, something that I've kind of worked on through therapy and, my own kind of sort of journey of healing. And I can see that in other ways as well, where I feel very disconnected oftentimes to my sort of on my mother's side, my, Venezuelan cultural sort of components that really I know as an adult, I've realized how much it shaped my way of thinking or how I navigating these like kind of multicultural kind of spaces, and also knowing, especially during the present moment with everything that's happening in U.S. Venezuelan conflict, and just the displacement and like losing touch with family, and um, not knowing how to kind of navigate that or what to do about that. So there's just a lot that feels lost, and sort of trying to reclaim or understand what is identity, what is cultural sort of connection, and anyway, like it all feels very, yeah, almost like very sort of out of touch, or out of reach oftentimes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think of reclaiming as really showing up with, and as safely as possible, with the identities that I am connected to. And so I don't know, because of the strong pull of whether it's multiculturalism, or sort of the melting pot, the U.S. melting pot experience. I think the reclaiming really is sort of this like moment to moment kind of process where I'm you know being intentional of sharing identities, my identities, or what feels most salient in the moment in those conversations. So navigating that. I think also, I mean, I'm thinking in particular with my family, there's that idea of like code switching in that context where, it's not maybe as safe or comfortable to be queer in the way that I identify as queer. And so you're not that, or that's how I'm perceiving it. So I think it's taking a lot of sort of coming back and forth closet in closet out closet process of bringing like this kind of merging, or of these different cultural identities together. I'm just thinking, as a 14-year-old and growing up in the 90s, and hearing sort of peers talk about like how, did you know that there is this like prominent chef in the community who's gay? And everyone was like, oh my God, really? And I'm like, wow, I didn't even know that was possible. Okay, sure. And so like it's so bizarre to think, wow, I can't believe I couldn't have seen that there are queer people in the world. But that's not the kind of that's the epistemic injustice, right? The knowledge was not there. It was erased or never introduced into the cultural context. So I think it's bringing that into those various spaces and navigating sort of elements of safety and comfortability. And I know I've had some very negative experiences with family, but they've also been mostly supportive as well. So it's just, and I've also looked at how the language barriers really impact how I communicate my identities. So I remember coming out to my mom and thinking, all right, let me find some kind of resource or something in Spanish or Italian. And then just like, it was just so difficult to kind of find resources back at that point. I mean, I'm sure things are, things are very different in terms of available resources. However, there's just kind of this constant navigation, and that can feel pretty intense and heavy at times.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is that the process of claiming and reclaiming identity, even different aspects of identity, whether it is, you know, gender, sexual orientation, or whether it is like ethnic or cultural, that often is so relational and communal, right? And context and situation specific. That in certain relationships or in certain environments and contexts, certain aspects of our identities feel a lot more naturally welcome and accepted, and others don't necessarily. And so we, when we're navigating that kind of sense of safety, we may be, showcasing parts of our identity that help us to experience a sense of belonging in a particular relationship or in a particular community or context, and but not showing other aspects of our identity, and showing that those parts in other relationships and contexts and in environments and communities. But then there might be also moments where there is this tension, and we may want those hidden parts of our identity to come forward and to be seen and be acknowledged and be welcomed and integrated and accepted in the environment where they're usually not, or they're usually not named, right? So whether that's bringing in your queerness to light in your family space, or it's bringing your, the immigrant heritage and the cultural experiences into maybe your connections with friends in the queer community or in your professional context and things like that. It is so context specific and so relational and ever changing.
And ever changing. Yeah. And I think if I reflect on my move from Canada to the US and how that further distances me from a sense of connection to, you know, cultural identity or identity, because then it's just this kind of like simplified, like you're Canadian, you're American, and I'm not going to go in depth on all these different nuanced pieces. Although when I do talk to some folks about some of the cultural identity factors, it's, questions of like, well, why don't you identify as Latino, And I'm like, well, that's an interesting question. The process of coming to that decision has been influenced by this kind of like assimilative process of, sort of sociocultural messaging of like what it means to be Canadian, Latino, or a US immigrant or whatever it may be. And so like there's just a lot of different sort of understandings and nuances there that you just kind of just accept as like, well, this is where we're at right now. And so I almost appreciate the kind of the narrative of evolution in terms of identity and cultural identities too, especially because I think of how different my mom and my dad's experiences would be compared to where I'm sitting right now with, my experience of immigration. And so so it brings a lot of appreciation and gratitude as well for those types of struggles that they've endured, that they've shared with us as the kids, So a lot to always unpack constantly.
Yeah. Yeah. As you reflect on that, of like your move to the US from Canada, what similarities or differences have you noticed or thought about in terms of your immigration experiences compared to your parents' immigration experience?
Yeah. Yeah. I think moving and immigrating to the US as an adult gave me this kind of sense of what it could mean to leave behind an established life and community, um, and starting over. And yeah, and even with all the privileges that can come with moving with a state, looking forward to a stable position, and being supported from the university and what have you. I think there's still this like, okay, how do I know there's privileges around language, education, you know, but it still comes with this kind of ongoing sort of, I see it as like a sort of a dull kind of grieving, disorienting kind of process. But also with that comes this like renewed sense of, just wanting to understand who I am and who, my history, and family history, and how that can help bring a sense of like groundedness and strength, because on some level, you move through different, social spaces and processes. And for me, it's like a lot of times you're just regarded as, yeah, a white American. But then at the same time, there's this piece around like, there is this in between kind of space. And I almost, as I'm talking here, I'm like, I want to find a way to continue to deepen that and do that sort of deep journeying of understanding identity and how that can really impact the work that I'm doing, working with LGBTQ young people, youth, and young adults, and them navigating their own intersectional identities. And many who have come to the US, immigrated to the US, and trying to understand the cultural context here as well. And so, yeah, while I don't have direct experiences of racism and forms of oppression that I'd be shielded given some of the privileges that come with my positionality or identities, it's also wanting to provide an opportunity to share and to open and create space for young folks who are experiencing immigration or the kind of impact of immigration, particularly with threats to deportation for undocumented folks, or just in general the hostile political climate here around immigration and xenophobia. So and I would argue Canada and many other places as well, of course, just to clarify that.
Yeah, yeah, it's not just in the States. They're definitely kind of in the news a lot more, maybe, but
Yeah.
it's not just there. And it's important for us wherever we're living to be conscious of the othering that happens and the exclusion that happens and the you know, prejudice or discriminatory narratives and then actions and laws that can be put into place too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's quite heartbreaking, actually. I guess there's been a lot of questioning of, yeah, like just in terms of power dynamics, like being an adult immigrant and a child of immigrants. It's just this kind of idea of like who's at the table and who's not. Like my family didn't speak English, and they mainly stayed, or my parents and my relatives didn't really speak English, and they stayed within their kind of communities and trying to find this like sense of difference. It's like maintaining their sort of cultural identity, their roots, while also, trying to navigate this new system and this new culture. And I think that just really kind of speaks to like how, that what are the things that you need to almost sort of sacrifice, or once you are in a space where it is potentially radically different, like what are the things you need to sacrifice or continually sacrifice or sort of deny almost aspects of your identity. And so I think that reclamation piece that you mentioned, the question around reclamation, and I think that's something that almost feels, at least my experience and talking to friends, colleagues in immigration experience, just continually figuring or finding that in different ways and in different contexts. And that's, yeah, to me, that is a resistance to dominant power structures in so many ways.
Yeah. So sometimes, actually, I think a lot of times for a lot of immigrant communities, um, kind of arriving in the diaspora, the there is this draw to stay perhaps even insulated in one's own kind of cultural community of belonging for safety, for support, for acknowledgement, but also as perhaps also that resistance against slowly losing aspects of identity and lived experience and heritage and connection to an ancestral land that, you know, sometimes staying within kind of like a more insular community is can be a part of claiming, reclaiming, protecting, especially for first generation immigrants. And I'm wondering for you what it was like to witness that as a kid growing up who was born in Canada. Witness that within your own family and your own community around you.
Yeah, I think I felt a lot of embarrassment or shame for not I mean, at that time, as a as a kid in, I'm thinking middle school, you know, anything from like my name, Giovanni, to just not having a similar experience as peers that and friends that were Canadian born, but like had, multiple generations of family here. And particularly coming from a sort of Western European, at least in Canada, more sort of British kind of cultural dominance or practice throughout the country and in different systems and what have you. And so I think there was a lot of kind of moving away from that and wanting to be different. And then also recognizing like as an adult or as a young adult when, like I'm also part of this white cultural identity as well, this like monolithic white identity, which comes with all these pieces of privilege and access. And so just recognizing that I don't want to be taking away space from those who may even experience the things that I was mentioning, but also in addition to that, the very real social exclusion, whether it be around racism or ableism and homophobia, transphobia, of course. But yeah, I kind of, I don't know, I kind of wish there was sort of, yeah, this understanding that there is this kind of sense of, for me at least, an indebtedness. It's like the narrative of like your parents crossed, they sacrificed, at least in some ways for me, they're, leaving some very stressful, precarious situations. And then, yeah, just, making sure that, yeah, there is a, like, respecting and appreciating the sacrifices that have happened, that have occurred, and then also finding or forging a path that is, that is more authentic and congruent to your identities or to who you feel you are with all these mixed cultural kind of experiences and in your development. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answered the question exactly, but I get a little tangential.
I think, yeah, feeling kind of embarrassed as a kid that when noticing that your family from an immigrant background doesn't clearly and naturally fit into the larger societal context in Canada and for you growing up in Toronto is something that I can definitely relate to as well. And I think a lot of people can, because when a family settles in a new society and geographic context, the intention is that they, and particularly the younger generations and new generations, will build a new life or build their life in this new place, right? And so, especially when we're very young, it's hard to really figure out how you're supposed to navigate this new world and system, especially when the elders don't have a lot of information to give you about what to expect or how to move through these spaces and systems and what you're supposed to do, what's the right thing, what's the wrong thing to do exactly. But then they have their own expectations of the younger generations upholding culture and spirituality and ethnicity and language and heritage. It's a lot of pressure to be in that in between to try to find to try to establish some sense of belonging in this new world and this new culture and society. And the way that we do that, especially when we're younger as well, but just generally, I think as human beings, is we try to connect on things that we share in common, or we try to see if we can amplify or elevate certain parts of our identity or experience that connect to that of other people. But then that leads to hiding or just kind of the falling away or receding to the background of other parts of our identity and lived experiences. But then when we go home or we're with our like cultural communities, they want those other aspects to be alive and well. And if they are moving through society with us in different spaces, or if they particularly, I would say for me, like if they see us interacting with our friends,
Yeah.
then they may want us to be interacting in a particular way that still keeps our cultural and ethnic and maybe religious and spiritual identities at the forefront. And if they're not noticing that, or if they see any way of us trying to like ignore it or avoid it, then we can get called out for it, right? And reprimanded for it. And it can feel really like shame inducing in that moment to be like, oh, so you noticed me doing this thing and you're interpreting it as my elder as me disrespecting or dishonoring your sacrifice to move here, and disrespecting and dishonoring your hope and all of your efforts to try and protect our cultural and maybe like spiritual and religious identity and heritage.
Yeah, absolutely. And to have those conversations with your parents or whomever, your caregivers, especially as a younger person. It almost feels impossible sometimes, like to say, I want to go down this path, or I want to live and be a certain way in the world that really deviates from how you probably saw your sense of development and identity formation. And then also kind of like the idea of like consistency. Like, I think I try to be as consistent as possible in these various like contexts. And I don't want to separate myself completely, or just like splicing, or not being, I guess, yeah, fragmented. I want to have more of a kind of a holistic sort of presentation of who I am in all spaces. And how much of myself can I safely bring out in family gatherings, or where there is a very sort of machismo, heterosexist kind of context within family gatherings, and wanting to challenge as well, but then like being dismissed because, oh, you're doing, what the, whatever the dominant culture is doing, and kind of feeling a lot of anger and resentment towards the dominant culture for that change, right? Um, so yeah, so many things there.
Yeah. I think for a lot of us, it leads to actually a lot of internal and also external battles, right? Like internally, we're battling with different parts of ourselves, and not having a template for how you're supposed to
Right.
try and integrate it either, right? So you're like making it up as you go along, and you're like a kid and a teenager, and you're making up most of everything in life as you go along, because everything is most things are new and novel, and life is kind of ever changing. But then there's these external battles, because both kind of the families and communities that we grew up in don't necessarily can't necessarily accurately resonate or relate to what we're experiencing. But then the host culture and the people who have been here for generations, let's say, also can't relate to the experience that we're having as well. And so it feels, and for me, I should really speak from personal experience. For me, it felt very othering. It felt
Yeah.
deeply, deeply
Yeah.
lonely for so long.
Yeah. How did you work with that? Like, what were the ways that you were able to, I don't know, support yourself in that deep loneliness or isolation? Like, were there things that kind of really supported you?
I can't say that I did a really great job of it necessarily when I was younger. Um, I think I really struggled with my mental health,
Yeah. Yeah.
as especially as like a preteen and a teenager. I really, really significantly struggled with my mental health. Um, for me, my saving grace was school. I was good at school. I was, and so I put almost everything that I had, all of my capacity into school, and uh try to see it as the way to maybe a better life, and being able to create something for myself, and maybe perhaps my family, that could be a bit more stable. Um, Also education, I think, in my family, but also generally in like Iranian culture and community, is higher education is highly valued. And so I did receive a lot of praise for my academic efforts and my academic successes. So it felt like a safe place to simultaneously grow and have possibilities and hope, but also a place to hide,
Mm,
and kind of like lick my wounds and try to mask just how much
mm.
I was struggling.
Yeah. Oh, that makes so much sense. Yeah. I mean, I know in my family, education was not at all emphasized, or, uh, sorry, mom, no, but it was just, I mean, maybe it was just also a part of yeah, kind of that sort of historical period. Not really, but I think there was just, you know, find a job. Yeah, hopefully you'll get a good job and that's it. And I didn't realize education could be this sort of haven of like self-awareness, growing self-awareness and deepening understanding of the world, at least according to these textbooks and what have you, and this literature. But I also really found that surrounding myself with other friends that experienced immigration or are first generation Canadian or a family of immigrants, that really brought a lot of comfort. And it wasn't me with a bunch of friends that their families have immigrated from like Italy specifically or whatever. It was mostly like, and maybe that's the Canadian sort of like narrative of multiculturalism, but being in immigrant communities and neighborhoods, I think that was really one of the most like healing parts of, growing up and not really understanding. Because I remember I wanted to be like John Smith and, have family from, the UK or whatever, right? And that was not, you know, ethnically speaking, that was not part of it, right? And so, yeah, I remember having really real conversations at a young age with friends whose family came from the Philippines and Jamaica, Greece. And so, yeah, just having that experience, or even like it was just, you didn't even have to talk about it really. It was just like, oh yeah, we're those immigrant kids,
Mm-hmm.
and that was cool, for a moment in that space. And then, and then it's not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I get that. I think my family, we settled in the Scarborough neighborhood of Toronto, and it's a really prominently immigrant populated area of the city. And most of my classmates were not necessarily kind of like white Canadian with, Anglo-Saxon backgrounds. Most of them were, first or second generation or third generation immigrant kids and from a lot of different countries across Asia. It was both, I think, because I struggled socially when I was younger. Now realizing I'm neurodivergent later in life puts a lot of that into context and makes me understand that in a different way.
Yeah.
But because I think I struggled so much socially just to begin with,
Hmm.
um, in my younger years, being in a predominantly immigrant space and community didn't necessarily make me feel grounded or
Yeah.
welcomed or accepted. I think it wasn't until my late teens, like later years in high school, that I started to notice that and appreciate that and welcome that in my life and interact with it a lot more. And so I think for me, those conversations with friends from immigrant backgrounds started in late teens and like early adulthood. And now, yes, the majority of my friends, I would say, are adult children of immigrants in one way or another. And I love that. It is so
Yeah.
deeply enriching. And there are things that we can talk about and complain about with similarities between families, even from different parts of the world, just like the generational differences, right?
Yeah.
Between us and our elders. But then many of them who are having kids too, now looking at like, oh, what is it going to be like for them trying to navigate these different identities and experiences?
Yeah. I know
Um,
I often think of my nieces and nephews who do not speak Italian or Spanish or just very disconnected from my parents' cultural context and upbringing. Um, yeah, you just see just how different that experience looks, at least, and I'm also thinking of the concept or the sort of the this kind of desire for sameness when looking at immigration experiences or like just the the ways that, I mean, talking to other children of immigrants who have come from sort of like say more of a Western European context, white identified, and really kind of ascribing a sameness of immigration process and experience to our friends of color who might have experienced something completely different and different pathways to immigration and coming to, or at least coming to Toronto at that point. And so I think for me, with going back to education, like learning and understanding that there are differences in and differential impacts based on your social locations, your identities, and making sure that that is, and being careful for me at least to not, just sort of unconsciously bring a sameness sort of element or vibe to the conversation. And I most certainly have been called in around that. And that's important because I do want to share and be passionate about like how much this has impacted me, and then immigration experiences have impacted me, but also not wanting to deny the realities out there around real barriers related to race and racism and other forms of oppression.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that because there are many folks who immigrate who, on top of experiencing like general xenophobia and like the culture shock of it all, and the challenges of assimilating and establishing a new life, are also often for the first time having to deal with racism,
Yeah.
right? And that is a very new and shocking experience, and for the younger folks it becomes like kind of ever present in a different way for them. I know for me it wasn't until we immigrated to Canada that I learned, and it wasn't even until my, like, early teens that I learned and realized I'm not white.
Mm.
I'm very white passing, so I have a lot of white passing privilege.
No,
I acknowledge that. I think for a lot of Iranians, not for all Iranians, but for a lot
yeah,
of Iranians, they perceive themselves as white,
yeah,
and many make references to kind of, like, Aryan roots, etc., etc. And
yeah.
so I think growing up in Iran, I saw myself and I was told that I and we, our family, was white. Now, I'm actually like ethnically mixed within the Iranian context. My parents are from significantly different regions of Iran with different languages and skin tones and their own kind of like cultural practices. And so, and there's definitely a lot of colorism in Iran. And I saw that kind of growing up, and felt it, but I didn't know I wasn't white until I came here to Canada, and I was like, "Oh, okay, that's interesting." And I think since then, it's been like decades of me trying to figure out what that means, what privileges it gives me in certain spaces and times, and what and where I don't actually have access to those privileges. I remember visiting family friends in smaller towns in southern Ontario that were predominantly white and had very little to no immigrant communities at the time. This was like 25 years ago or so. I I felt very uncomfortable being in those spaces, and I felt very unsafe even, like, walking during the day outside by myself because I could see people looking at me in a different way, and I felt very othered. Like, they could tell I didn't they could tell I didn't belong, and then I genuinely felt like I didn't belong. I think it was in those experiences I started to it started to really dawn on me of like, "Oh, I'm living and growing up in Scarborough, surrounded primarily by people of color from all
Mm.
these different regions of the world." And so I'm not actually used to being in a predominantly white community. Yes, there were white people for sure in Scarborough as well, but there, I think at in the late 90s, early 2000s when I was growing up in Scarborough, it was um, so much more diverse and still is. So that differentiation was interesting for me. Like, okay, what does it even mean to be white? And I can't say that I've exactly figured it out still yet.
No, especially we know it's a moving target. Like, if we think of the historical context of whiteness and how it has shifted over time, and just seeing how groups of people have been incorporated into whiteness for whatever reason, largely probably economic reasons, and to, you know, maintain a hierarchy, a racial hierarchy. I think that is an interesting question right now, especially as we're seeing heightened polarization along, you know, lines of, systemic oppression and injustice related to race and sexual orientation, gender identity. And so, like, what is it, like, what will it mean to be white identified or not, in 50 years, 100 years? I mean, it's kind of a mind-boggling thing, fascinating, but also thinking what we know of history, at least from a North American context, we see that not a lot has changed as well in terms of the racial hierarchies. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, there's just so many things there and then so coming to and immigrating to North America, let's say, um, and as a person of color, what do you have to sort of de-emphasize or not show um, in your kind of day-to-day interactions, and with people and who are Canadian born or American born or what have you, and that are white identified? And so, like, there's it's such a complex, like, sort of layered sort of challenge or phenomenon that we still all figuring out, I think, in so many ways.
Yeah, because white supremacy is a real thing, and it's
Yeah.
ever present across the world, and it's impacting everywhere across the world in different ways. And I think even in terms of a lot of Iranians perceiving themselves as white, I think about it in that context of like how has white supremacy had an impact on that? How has different, eras of even colonization within Iran, yes, Iran's done their own colonization as well across history, but how have even like their interactions or trade with European countries impacted them, especially kind of their experiences over the past 150 years, right? Different interactions and ties with France, for instance, at times, or with England at times, or with the US before the revolution. um, how has that shaped how Iranians perceive themselves as white, and how were they welcomed in a global arena, perhaps, especially before the revolution, when they maybe saw themselves as more connected to Western European, North American whiteness through these kind of you know these trade agreements, these interactions, these exchanges with these different countries that significantly shifted after the revolution in 1979, and the kind of Islamophobia and the racism that a lot of Iranians experience in Western European and North American countries as well, um, after the revolution, that they may not have experienced before then. And I don't have data on it. It just these are like things that I kind of like contemplate on sometimes in trying to even understand the historical implications and influences of whiteness within Iran, and within Iranian communities, and even Iranian communities in the diaspora, and then myself, and even within my own family, trying to really understand that.
Yeah, I'm hearing, like, the emotional, psychological labor that comes on top of already real barriers that families that have immigrated and children of immigrants that would experience, and then there's this constant, like, yeah, like, navigating and reflecting on some of these things that, yeah, but many others will never have to. And so, like, just naming that burden as well, the internal sort of conflicts or burden that comes with navigating identities. It's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm even thinking of the racial hierarchies in Latin America, as I'm thinking of the ways, there's that structure obviously is very embedded, whereas whiteness comes with more privilege or more access to resources and opportunities, and just that not being discussed or mentioned in any way, like you're Latino, that's it. Not saying that I probably don't even want to generalize that and just speak from my own like family experience, but I just think of the importance of what I would see as a critical consciousness, like actually bringing in, yeah, there's education, there's formal education, but there's just this like real sort of awareness that develops, and like just recognizing your place in this kind of global context and what is possible there, like the potential for critical action from, if we look at some of that literature around critical consciousness. And I think that happens in such really beautiful and informal ways in our families, and to support, well-being and resistance and survival, and I potentially, hopefully, thriving in the host land or the new place that families have immigrated to. So yeah, I think that is a beautiful component that really can help young people, um, or children that are kind of growing up and understanding these sort of bicultural, multicultural sort of contexts, to sort of make sense of it a little bit more and understand it and normalize some of that too. Hmm. Yeah. And, I think some of the questions that felt challenging were like, I think it was around a piece of advice to your younger self. And then this, I kind of think, telling myself, younger me, you don't have to earn your right to exist. Like it's an existential thing at the end of the day. Like your parents sacrifice, they're real sacrifices, but also and maybe this is an individualistic, westernized perspective, but yeah, our happiness, authenticity is important. Those aren't betrayals to our family and the sacrifices that they've made. So yeah, that all comes up a lot for me too. And like, am I letting them down? And, especially moving and noting that I am not as connected, especially around like caregiving pieces for mom who is not in great health right now. And so, yeah, you kind of hold that guilt piece as well. And so, yeah, just, and then understanding why immigration happens, and particularly around, sort of safety and dangerous contexts, and then the way refugees, asylum seekers are treated. There's just so many things that kind of, yeah, make my blood boil, and like what can we do, And so that's the ongoing work, I think, advocacy work and political work that needs to be done. So get involved. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that around the advice that you would give to your younger self, that
Yeah.
you you have a right, you deserve to exist authentically as exactly who you are, as someone who's established this multifaceted identity, navigating all these different worlds and versions of self. And that when that authentic, multifaceted version of self is different than what families and elders expected, that for them, yes, it may feel like a betrayal in the moment, but it's not an intentional act of betrayal. It may in fact reflect to them, like it's like holding up a mirror for them of different pieces that they have lost, that have fallen away from their lives. And
Yeah.
so it can activate grief for them. But I think sometimes that grief gets expressed as anger or resentment, because betrayal, because there is a sense of like betrayal that's perceived to be happening, that I think a lot of younger first, second generation, even third generation immigrants are not doing in an intentional way. They're just trying to exist in in a new world, in a world that's different than that of their elders.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I do wonder if that might shift with increased sort of understanding and a knowledge of different cultures and access to that information via, online or what have you, just and education potentially, like, and thinking of the rigid kind of standards and making it harder to immigrate and what that means in terms of like level of education and understanding of the world and different cultural contexts. Like, does that shift the openness potentially for, different cultural experiences, or more of a kind of a blending of cultural experiences for their children, and I think with my family, no education and, factory work, and there was that was their world, and maybe that was also, this is pre-internet and what have you. So it's like there was no desire to learn about these other cultures and other ways of being. And so I wonder if that will evolve over time, or look differently, in terms of families' sort of openness to embracing different cultural expressions, including things like queerness, and not taking or not pursuing career paths that, maybe aren't seen as, as culturally congruent to their parents. So yeah, there's a lot there to kind of wonder about.
Yeah. And I think even our parents and maybe even grandparents, if they immigrated with us or before us, before the internet, but even with the internet, I think the most effective way in which they learn about any of us learn about other people is through relationship. And so many of our elders, our first generation immigrant elders, are introduced to different people through the friendships that we as the younger generations of immigrants bring into their lives, or the partnerships, the romantic partnerships that we bring into their lives through us, right? That they get to know our friends and our partners, who not oftentimes are from different parts of the world, right? Especially if we happen to be living in diverse multicultural urban centers, and they're connecting to these people on a human level. They're getting to know them. They're learning to love them, and they are embracing them, and they're integrating them into family and inviting them to like family events and holiday parties and things. And they are then, through that experience of love and connection, learning about these different cultures, these different ethnic racial experiences, these different religious practices, and even different queer identities and things, and how they're navigating the world. And I've seen it. I've seen the elders in my life engage in that process of learning, and that they embrace it, because I think at the core of it, because they love us,
Yeah.
and they want to be included in our lives. And I think because they also recognize, for better or worse, that we have had to establish chosen family
Yeah.
when we don't have, especially when we don't have access to a larger extended family in the diaspora.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is, yeah, speaking to me big time right now. Just looking at the contrast there with, early days. I remember like my grandmother saying, make sure you find um a girl who speaks Italian or Spanish, and like they have to, so we can understand her. And I'm like, okay, so many problematic pieces to that that advice, or that command, whatever it was. But yeah, and then the exposure, right? Especially when we, thinking of family that do, bring in their queer partner or queer friends, or thinking of family who are, multiracial family now, and sort of thinking of the parents, or my parents or grandparents, and how they've sort of had to go through a process of understanding that, just because there is what would you are seeing, perceiving as difference, that also is not a bad thing. And so, yeah, And so just trusting their growth as well, and just respecting that level of courage and bravery to leave, right? And whether the circumstances were to escape or to flee, dangerous situation or political situation, or for whatever reason to improve their well-being or their life, I think just honoring and recognizing that, and really just, I think, communicating that if possible, that, is can be a beautiful bonding, connecting thing that might bring a little bit more connection to our own sort of displaced cultural experience.
Yeah, that's very well said. And what would it be like if we intergenerationally notice and acknowledge and appreciated the courage that all the different people, these different generations are practicing in different ways. For our elders, it was the courage to leave and to find a new home and try to settle and establish safety and some level of stability for their families and for you know the adult children of immigrants that are us who are growing in these new countries. But hopefully for them, it's also noticing the courageousness within us to be navigating these new worlds and systems and relationships and introducing them to new ways of existing in the world, new ways of being just human.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we could hopefully introduce the sort of a more broader socio-political sort of understanding that, it's I mean, the reasons why we see difference as, negative, or, thinking that, the cultural sort of superiority or ethnocentrism as well that exists oftentimes in sort of dominant culture, and then also within cultures of, thinking of ways to kind of challenge that and not see people as lesser than, and looking at the systemic pieces that contribute to those beliefs or understandings of other cultures, other groups of people. And so, yeah, I mean, maybe I'm just speaking from my social work academic space right now, but I think that's such an important piece for us to bring to these family conversations if they are possible.
Yeah. So yeah, what you're touching on is like in the host culture, especially if it's predominantly white in Western Europe and North America, even like Australia, New Zealand, that the focus and the centering of white culture and it is significant. But then within each of these different immigrant communities in the diaspora, there could be a centering of just their own cultural experience and their own ethnic experience and their own like religious or spiritual experience, right? And that we can choose to be very insular and othering, or we can choose to hold space for all these different differences in all these different relationships and the differences within ourselves. And essentially kind of like practicing trust that we won't lose, that by noticing and acknowledging these differences within ourselves and other people, that we won't lose ourselves, we won't lose culture, we won't lose heritage, we won't lose that we can practice trust in that. And that might be a really big claim to make because I'm definitely acknowledging that like there's a lot of systems in place to try and make sure you lose it so that you can assimilate into these larger systems and contexts and institutions for sure. I guess I'm more talking in a like relational communal level. Can we practice trust that in holding space for and inviting difference within our relationships and within ourselves, that we won't lose access completely to the cultural and spiritual heritage and ancestry that we carry as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And ancestry is such an important piece. And I hope that's continuing to sort of flourish in our kind of discussions around like the political climate, or just kind of like the ways that we have lost touch with our ancestral kind of roots. And for white identified folks, those who have European ancestry, and from a colonial perspective, like recognizing as well that you do have ancestry, that there is an important piece there to understand, to reduce hopefully the level of othering and sense of dominance, related to compared to other races and ethnicities and cultures, you know. But yeah, how do young folks, I always go back to young folks that are who have recently immigrated to a new place, and like what that developmental trajectory is like. And I think that's such a, like, you're just so deeply shaped by, you know, these cultural sort of learnings and socialization. So like, how do you not lose that? And that's a value. You don't want, for me, it's, you don't want to lose that, your ancestral cultural connection, and then also try to navigate a new space. And so I think at that younger age, that's important. Yeah, like your nervous system is developed, like it's just all these things that you're just constantly exposed to that can be so stressful, and how to like even cope with some of that, like from a mental health perspective, right? You know, it's,
Hmm.
yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot to be navigating all at once.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Gio, thank you so much for being a guest on Growing Between Worlds and for sharing your story and your wisdom with us today. It's been fantastic to share this time with you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Forouz.
Thanks again for listening or watching this episode of Grown Between Worlds. We're grateful to share this space and community with you.
Please follow or subscribe to our podcast, share it with people who might resonate, join our newsletter for more info and resources, leave us a comment if you'd like, and join us again for future episodes. And remember, your story matters, your voice matters, and you're not alone. Grown Between Worlds is sponsored by Forouz Salari Online Counseling and Consulting.